Hello, and welcome to my presentation on a cute little creature called the ocellated skink. So, of course, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I have put together a vivarium for this species. The design of a naturalistic vivarium should be based upon several different resources. One is natural history information that has been gathered from the field. So that would be research on diet, habit, the weather, social behaviors, and so on. Also, captive husbandry techniques that have been used for years. And these are the techniques that have been sufficiently tested in order to prove that they are, as of now, the most effective ways to provide a good quality of life for a captive animal. These are not the methods that are used primarily because, quote, this is how it's always been done, unquote. In addition, I use data collected from studies that were conducted ex situ in academic settings. So all of these resources combined together can hopefully create the best living space for a skink, as well as providing an effective, evidence-based captive husbandry plan for its everyday care. So first off is a brief background on ocellated skinks. Ocellated skinks are of the family, and please excuse me if I'm not pronouncing this correctly, Skinkidae and the genus Chalcides. They are found in a great number of countries, and in some they are actually considered invasive, and they are considered quite common. According to the IUCN Red List, there are no major threats to this species, and it is of least concern. These skinks are named for their patterns of ocelli along their backs. They have a cone-shaped head, a long, almost snake-like body, short limbs, and smooth, glossy scales. They generally have a darker dorsal area, usually bronze or tan, with a pale belly. These are tiny reptiles that grow to a total length of between 7 to 9 inches. Ocellated skinks have a very extensive geographic range. In the wild, they live in the northern part of Africa, down as far as Nigeria and Ethiopia, and they extend over into Saudi Arabia, Greece, and Turkey. Their ideal environment is considered to be the Mediterranean area. These skinks are found in shrublands, grasslands, moist sandy open areas, areas with sparse scrub, vegetated dunes, which are found further inland, and even oases. In residential built-up areas, people have discovered them in palm plantations, plant nurseries, around houses, in courtyards, and in gardens. According to one journal article that I used for my care plan, these skinks like a lot of space. The more area that they have to roam free, the less stressed they will be. Therefore, my tank is fairly sizable at 30 inches long by 12.75 inches wide by 18 inches tall. Though these animals are terrestrial and do like to burrow a bit, they also do like to climb. Therefore, I think that the height of 18 inches is acceptable. These animals prefer a solitary lifestyle, and unfortunately with this species, cannibalism and, in general, saurophagy seem to increase in insular conditions due to the scarce resources and high lizard densities. I would consider my vivarium an insular condition. And though there will be no scarcity of resources, I would plan to properly care for and feed any skink or skinks within the tank. I still plan to only have one skink. I do not consider 2 skinks to be a high lizard density, but I simply do not want to take the chance that one skink does not get along with the other. Fighting may ensue, and in the worst circumstances, cannibalism may result. I got my hands on a vintage tank, probably from the early 60s to late 70s, and as you can see in that inset photo, that the original sticker is still on it, talking about the guarantee that goes along with it, and that the guarantee is void if you remove the sticker. The sticker is still there, so I guess technically this tank is still under warranty. Yay. So anyway, this tank is made of steel, glass, and it has gray slate for the bottom. It is very solidly built. I don't know if you've ever heard the saying when someone or something is really beefy and solid and well made that it's built like a tank. Well, this tank is built like a tank. So it is incredibly heavy. If you ever happen to come across one of these tanks, possibly at a flea market or in a friend's attic or basement, you definitely need two people to carry it. I don't recommend moving it by yourself. Unless you lift weights on a regular basis, you will break or pop or pull something in your body if you try it alone. It is vintage, so of course it was a little dirty. While cleaning it, I had to evict 2 spiders, but don't worry, I didn't kill them. I just gently guided them out with a piece of paper. So I can truthfully say that no creatures were harmed in the making of this vivarium. My rock background will of course cover the back glass panel of the tank, but to provide a little more privacy and to avoid too much of an open feeling as though the animal is being left out in the open on display, both the left and right sides of the glass tank will also be partially covered with some cardboard decorated to simulate rock formations. These coverings will be adhered to the outside of the tank so that they do not need to be cleaned. And you'll see a photo featuring the side panel and background together when we get to the section where we talk about substrate. I decided to hand carve the ledging for my background, and I used a pocket knife to accomplish this. One of the pros of using a pocket knife was it was pretty inexpensive and definitely cheaper than using a hot wire tool. But one of the cons was it was irritatingly messy. And as you can see, static electricity was not on my side. For much of the construction, I used a crafting product called tacky glue, and I liked it especially because it's non-toxic. It's an all-purpose glue that's very durable, so I didn't have to worry about toxic effects on my skink, and I didn't have to worry about the background falling apart because it is pretty heavy-duty glue. During the drying process, I did use toothpicks just to keep all the pieces together until it was thoroughly dried, which did take a while because this is thick glue. In addition, I knew that when I would apply the sealant, that product was going to help to complement the glue strength. I wanted a background that looked like it was a rock wall that had a lot of cracks and crevices, and in order to accomplish that, I literally broke the foam so that I could get some nice cracks, and then I glued it all back together again. And to make it more rock-like, at the top of the background, I just carefully broke off some pieces from the top to make it look more jagged, like the top of a natural rock face. To coat the foam, I used Polyblend, which is a cement-based grout. I used their color that's labeled linen. It was non-sanded grout, so I was hoping that would make for a smoother application of the sealant. It's also supposed to be non-shrinking and fortified with polymers for hardness and durability. I do believe if I use this again to create a background, I would do more layers. It did hold up pretty well, but I did notice a little bit of flaking. So that's why I'm thinking maybe a few more layers might help. On the other hand, there's also the option to go with the recommendation that was mentioned in the Lizard Landscapes video, which is to try and use the brand that's called Foam Coat, which is from the Hot Wire Foam Factory. That might be an option to try out to see if it performs better than this grout. To paint the background, I used acrylic paints that were certified non-toxic. Once again, I want to give my skink a safe environment to live in. The paints were a matte finish, and the labels said that they could be used on a variety of surfaces, so I tried it on the grout, and it worked perfectly fine. The paints were water-based, which I think is definitely a better option than oil-based when working with grout as well as with the sealant. For the sealant, I used a product called AFM Safe Coat Hard Seal, and this is a low odor, acrylic emulsion polymer, which is supposed to be ideal for high porous surfaces. I especially liked it because it is certified non-toxic, it has not been tested on animals, and it has no animal ingredients. I also like that it's supposed to be safe for chemically sensitive individuals. It is VOC compliant, and that means that it emits a low amount of volatile organic compounds. And I think that this is all very important because my skink is going to be in a tank, so it is a semi-enclosed area, and I don't want to use any products that could possibly build up odors in the enclosure. I did actually contact the company that makes this sealant, and they did assure me that it would be safe to use with pets. Okay, on to my substrate choices. Depending upon the areas in which they live, these skinks can encounter dirt and or sand. In one of the studies from my care plan, the researchers found that coarse-grained sand was likely too energetically costly for these skinks to burrow into. Fine-grade sand may be too dense for the skinks to perform the sustained lateral undulatory locomotion that is necessary in the subsurface. Therefore, it seemed like a good idea to mix topsoil into my sand to create a substrate mixture. The soil should loosen up the sand a little bit and allow the skink to have an easier time burrowing. This is also going to make it easier for the skink to hide in the substrate if it chooses to do so. I made up a DIY semi-arid mix, which is 3 parts plain topsoil and 2 parts play sand. This ratio would hopefully not only loosen up the play sand, but will also help the substrate to drain reasonably well. These skinks like to burrow, but due to their morphology, they are not the best of diggers. Apparently, they don't seem to go down very deep into a substrate. According to the same study that I mentioned in the previous slide, the skinks in their study reached a depth of 1.65 inches at the most. So somewhere between 2.5 to 3 inches is a good amount of substrate for these skinks. I put 3 inches into my tank, so the skink does not hit the hard bottom surface of the enclosure. And of course, here you can see the background with a side panel, so you see how the skink will be getting kind of like an immersive environment that hopefully will make it feel safe and secure. Of course, like people, animals have their own preferences. If the skink seems to not want to burrow as much as is naturally expected, then the substrate ratio can be tweaked a bit. Maybe a half and half mixture will be preferable. I think that it will just take time as I watch this skink's behavior and adjust to what it seems to best prefer. Now, if the skink seems really unhappy, which is doubtful but possible, there is the option to replace the play sand with a brand name sand that could be found at a pet store, such as the one pictured here. This sand switch may encourage the skink to exhibit more burrowing behavior. I do not plan to release microfauna into the substrate. Instead, I will be cleaning out the tank on a daily basis. Spot cleaning should be made easier with the handy tool pictured here. This scoop is probably going to work better if I choose to make the substrate ratio favor sand as opposed to soil. All of the substrate will need to be fully replaced every 3 months, earlier if it seems necessary. During substrate replacement, the entire enclosure should be disinfected with a reptile-safe disinfectant. In the wild, the ocellated skink's ideal environment is considered to be the Mediterranean area. Ideal temperatures in this area would provide a basking surface temperature of between 110 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, a basking air temperature of 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and a cool refuge temperature of 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. At night in the Mediterranean, it can get fairly cool. Temperatures can be between 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I hope that the lighting options that I have chosen will best simulate appropriate temperatures, as well as provide the best quote-unquote natural light. So, since this species of skink can be found across such a wide geological range, it can withstand a considerable range of UV exposure. This map shows you that in its northernmost habitats, it can experience around a 3 or 4 UVB intensity. And further south, this skink can even tolerate an exposure of up to 8 or even 9 or greater on the UV index. I decided for my skink that I would go a little less intense and choose a 5 UVB bulb, most especially because I'm choosing to simulate an environment that would be in more of the northern regions of its range. A 5 UVB bulb will be placed above the basking area, alongside a halogen flood heat bulb lamp, which should also be above the basking site. The UVB bulb's light should span roughly half the length of the enclosure, no less than 1/3, and no more than 2/3 the enclosure length. At 18 inches, the uppermost bulb on the slide seemed like a good length, but I didn't think that 15 watts was strong enough because this is a pretty sizable tank, so I decided to go with the bulb pictured below it. At 22 inches, this bulb is pretty long, but the tank is 30 inches long, so I think that this bulb's length is still acceptable, and I preferred the stronger wattage since this one is 24 watts. A linear LED bulb, measuring around 2/3 to 3/4 the length of the tank, would be used to provide a general bright, quote-unquote, natural daylight in the enclosure. I did not pick a colored light, even though these do seem to be offered in pet stores. I wanted to stick with the natural white light. The LED bar shown is 22 watts and 18.5 inches. This brand also makes a bulb that is 34 watts and 22 inches, which I think would also be acceptable. Pictured here is a photo of the halogen flood heat bulb lamp mentioned earlier. Since I have only one skink, then one lamp should create a large enough basking area. It's good to use a dimmable bulb because I may need to reduce the heat output. In my research, I learned that if I dim the bulb by half or more, it's best to just get a lower wattage bulb. You also see here pictures of a good lamp dome fixture for the heat bulb. I prefer the dome to have a metallic, reflective interior as opposed to a white interior. All bulbs are positioned outside of the enclosure on top of the cover screen. I've established a thermal gradient that will help to provide a comfortable quality of life and will encourage natural behaviors. But to keep track of that gradient, it's a good idea to monitor the temperatures in different parts of the enclosure with a thermometer. The one here has a fastener, so I can position it wherever I want in the tank. It's a good idea to get 2 of these, so there's one for each side of the tank. A temperature gun is also a reasonable option, but I think that it should be supplemental to the thermometers, not instead of the thermometers. As mentioned earlier, a basking air temperature of 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit will be provided at one end of the tank, and a cool refuge area with a temperature of 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit will be provided at the cooler side of the tank. At night, to simulate the skink's natural habitat, all lights can be shut off so that the temperature can lower to between 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It should be noted that skinks behave differently depending on the time of the year. They are generally nocturnal in the summer and diurnal in the winter. To simulate the summer cycle during the warmer times of the year, day length, which is the time that the lights are on, can range from around 12 hours up to around 14 hours per day. And the skink can be fed the usual 2 to 3 times per week. Since their natural habitat does experience a regular period of reduced temperatures during the winter months, I also plan to recreate the winter season. To simulate the winter cycle, As mentioned earlier, the day length, the amount of time the lights are in day mode, should be around 10 hours during the coldest winter months. It also seems that these skinks need a cooling rest period during the coldest months of winter. This cooling session is likely to play a role in hormonal regulation for the species, and temperature regulation seems to be directly linked with pregnancy. Ultimately, as in most animals, good hormonal regulation means a better quality of life and hopefully a longer, healthier life. Therefore, from around the beginning of December to around the end of March, the length of time that the heat lamp is on should be reduced very gradually to about 3 hours per day. As mentioned earlier, this skink's natural habitat is generally arid, but they can also experience humidity. Ocellated skinks prefer to live in places that are fairly dry during the day, but very humid at night. So, at night when the lights are shut off, the enclosure should be misted. Then the humidity level should go up to around 90 to 100%, but then it will slowly dry out overnight to around 15 to 35% humidity. This level should be fine during the day. One option to simulate day and night is to manually turn the lights off and on every day, but I think using a timer is a more sensible way to control the on-off cycles of the enclosure fixtures. This Zilla product has a 24/7 timer with digital programming. It will provide a natural day and night cycle that promotes a healthy functioning circadian rhythm. Plus, I won't need to worry about turning fixtures on and off. Now, of course, we want to try and mimic a natural habitat for this skink. To simulate a skink's life in its native regions, my skink's enclosure has lots of hiding places, which include ledges, rocks, a hide, and plants. As mentioned earlier, the skink will also be able to burrow down and hide in the substrate if it chooses to do so. The plants that I used are the jade plant, festucia, sedgegrass, and the echeveria plant, commonly known as the succulent hens and chicks. Because of my concern that the skink, or even some of its prey, such as crickets, might eat live decorative plants, I used artificial plants. There is a water dish and food dish at one end of the tank, and ledges that can serve as basking sites at the other end of the enclosure. This layout promotes a temperature gradient, cooler at one end and warmer at the other end. There are also other basking ledges that extend across the length of the rock background. Besides the ledges, the enclosure also has other vertical space, and this will further encourage this skink's natural tendency to climb. There is a tree structure in the right back corner that the skink can access from one of the ledges. Also, there is some branching in the foreground that can be used for climbing. So he's offered several climbing options at several different levels, and these different climbing options, they're made of different materials, so he has different textures to experience. I should mention that yes, the branch that I have in the foreground, I think it's a bit skinny. Preferably, I would have liked it a little bit thicker, but I chose from options that were right outside my house, and I actually liked the shape of this branch and how it's Y-shaped at the bottom. The way that it's shaped, it just would seem easy for the skink to climb on and more stable. But I also should mention that I had to saw it myself, and I am a total wimp. And I even got slightly sore having to saw this twiggy little branch. It took a while for me to saw it, and so that was another reason why I did not pick a much thicker branch to put in my enclosure. Here's a slightly better, larger view of the enclosure. My skink's going to have more opportunities to interact with his environment in the enclosure, and his natural thermoregulatory behaviors, as well as his inclination for climbing, will be encouraged. So Basically, he's going to be able to go up, down, and all over the place, and hopefully enjoy himself. Skinks are primarily insect eaters and will enjoy a variety of invertebrates such as dubia roaches, crickets, isopods, rice flower beetles, mealworms, and small superworms. It is important to note that all insects, except for the isopods mentioned, which are already high in calcium, should be dusted with a high-quality calcium powder, especially made for reptiles. This will help to prevent bone disorders. As mentioned earlier, they really do seem to like vegetated areas such as gardens and plantations. So it is fine to occasionally feed my skink plants such as alfalfa, collard greens, dandelion greens, basil, kale, and parsley, just to name a few. Being an adult, my skink can be fed 2 to 3 times a week. And FYI, babies and pregnant females should be fed daily, but juveniles are like adults and can be fed 2 to 3 times per week. The amount of food that is given to my skink is going to depend mostly on the size of the insects. The best plan is to put a certain number of insects, such as mealworms, in its dish, and then wait to see how many of the worms the skink will eat before it is satiated. This is a good way to figure out the size of my skink's appetite. In a pinch, I can also feed my skink a commercial diet, such as Repashy superworm pie or Repashy mealworm pie. One way that I plan to improve the skink's welfare is by providing live prey enrichment by randomly scattering live mealworms around the tank. He'll have an opportunity to explore, search, and discover his prey. One of the studies that I have listed in my references observed that this kind of enrichment encourages skinks to eat more healthily, be more active on the substrate, and engage in more walking. I thought that I might be able to spend a little quality time with my reptile by way of a feeding session. I like these tongs because they feature a soft tip in case the skink misses the food and bites the tong. I don't want him to hurt his mouth. Now, the water bowl that I ultimately picked is nice and deep, but it's not particularly wide. And as I mentioned earlier, when talking about creating a substrate, animals are different and animals have their own preferences. So I figured if for some reason I see that maybe he isn't as happy with his water bowl as he probably should be, I also took a picture of another option that I did find at a pet store. So you can see it here on this slide. It's definitely wider and it's a little more shallow as well. So he may have an easier time with it and he may prefer it. It's also nice because 2 of the sides of this bowl are at right angles, so you can actually position it in a corner of the tank. So it's kind of like a space-saving sort of bowl, which is kind of nice. I'd like to touch on the subject of breeding very quickly, even though I do not plan to breed my skink. I would prefer a male, but it is difficult to sex these skinks. So when a new skink is purchased, it may end up being a female that is inadvertently already pregnant. Ocellated skinks seem to be fairly easy to breed in captivity, as they are commonly bred in Europe for the pet trade. They have been known to breed multiple times within the same year. This skink species is viviparous. They nurture their young via a placenta pre-birth, and then they give birth to live young. And interestingly, pregnancy in these skinks impairs their immunoreactivity. I found this particularly intriguing because women experience suppressed immune systems during pregnancy. Generally, reptiles select body temperatures that reflect their current physiological state, such as pregnancy, for example. Research has suggested that females will have a more successful pregnancy when they maintain a relatively high body temperature. This is why, if you know that your skink is pregnant, it is so important to follow the seasonal light and heating cycles. Also, pregnancy can negatively impact fat stores, so it is important that a pregnant female gets plenty of nutrition and should be fed on a daily basis. Experienced herpetologists say that a female will probably stop eating towards the end of her pregnancy. This is normal behavior. However, she does have to be fed well, that means on a daily basis, after she gives birth. Females give birth to between 2 to 7, or sometimes even more, fully formed live young. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, adult ocellated skinks, when not given enough personal space, can become stressed and can practice saurophagy. However, juveniles can be particularly vulnerable to attacks from adults when they don't have enough space or opportunities to escape. The tails of juveniles are routinely found in the stomachs of other ocellated skinks. This means that it is not outside the realm of possibility that, if a mother skink becomes severely stressed, she may resort to eating her own young. This is why it is so important to give a mother and her babies plenty of places to hide and plenty of choices of refuges. Providing the mother with privacy will hopefully prevent the eating of any babies. Contact with the enclosure should be kept to an absolute minimum during the time that the mother is near to giving birth, i.e., just stick to basic cleaning, basic feeding. Don't make any drastic changes such as moving furniture around, adding new plants, etc. Once you are aware that the babies have been born, and since this is a curious species, you will probably see the babies wandering around the enclosure, exploring their new world. Then try your best to remove all the babies and place them in a separate, smaller enclosure. They should be fed on a daily basis, preferably with foods that are easier to ingest, such as larvae and microcrickets. It is advisable to avoid handling the babies for the first couple of weeks, as they are easily frightened and can drop their tails at the slightest thing when very young. Ocellated skinks take around 2 years to mature, but they may be capable of reaching sexual maturity as early as 1 year of age. This means that, unless you want a lot more babies, separate those juveniles within 1 year of their birth. And here is my original schematic. Essentially, I pretty much stuck to the original plan. There were just a few minor changes. Instead of using a UVB bulb and a dome light, I used a bar-shaped UV light instead. And then, instead of 2 branches near the front of the enclosure, I just used 1. Once I started putting my tank together, 1 branch just seemed like more than enough. And I would hope that my skink agrees, because here you see him climbing on his Y-shaped tripod branch. Here he is basking and warming himself up a bit. Just keep in mind that this is a mock-up, so you see the hood lamp as well as the dome lamp, but there is no real UVB bulb or heat bulb in either of them, just a flashlight for effect in the dome. Here he is getting a little privacy and peeking out of his hide. Here he is enjoying a meal, and since he lives by himself, he doesn't have to worry about anybody else being a little greedy at the dinner table, which is nice. And since he is the only skink in the tank, he gets all of this space to himself. So he gets to relax, and I don't want to anthropomorphize here, but I'm going to anyway. He gets to enjoy himself, and hopefully he feels like he's, living the good life. My skink and I would like to thank you for watching this presentation on the design of his home. And in case you are interested, here are my references, and here are more references, and here are the rest of my references. Goodbye, and I hope you have a good day.